Hello, sisters. Intercourse by Dworkin, published in 1987. 4MS. Quote, all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. End quote. W.B. Yeats. Easter 1916. Quote, true rebels, after all, are as rare as true lovers, and, in both cases, to mistake a fever for a passion can destroy one's life. End quote. James Baldwin. No Name in the Street. Quote, he lost no time, got his belt undone, said, quote, I could go through you like butter, end quote. Edna O'Brien, Knight. Acknowledgements. I thank my friends and colleagues in the international feminist anti-pornography movement for their courage and love. There are so many, and I hope they will forgive me for not naming them here as individuals. I thank John Stoltenberg for the gift of his love and friendship. I especially thank Elaine Markson, Jerry Toma, Phyllis Langer, Sandra Elkin, Robin Morgan, Anne Simon, Catherine A. McKinnon, Kathleen Barry, Valerie Harper, Judith Molina, and Jerry Spence for their tremendous support in the last years. Peter Gross and Jane Wood at Seeker and Warburg in London have been generous and strong advocates of my work, and I am deeply grateful to them. I thank Laura Wolfe at the Free Press for commissioning and publishing this book. Kathleen Barry made a special contribution to the discussion of language in Chapter 7, and the idea that women speak a second language and have no language of our own is hers. I thank Letty Cotton Pegrobin and Leah Fritz, each of whom challenged me to write this book. I am privileged to know feminist activists and writers from many parts of the world who fight for women's freedom with militance and compassion, and I thank them as women for the pride they inspire. Andrea Dworkin, New York City, 1986. Foreword by Ariel, Levi. Like most writers, Andrea Dworkin thought her work was underappreciated in her lifetime. Like very few of them, she was right. Dworkin the persona, the mythical figure, the inverted sex symbol, eclipsed Dworkin the writer in the public imagination. There are many more people who have strong feelings about her than there are people who have actually read her work. If this is the first book of hers you've encountered, brace yourself. She had a voice like no other. Perhaps the most prominent quality of Dworkin's writing is its ferocity, its relentless intellectual and ideological confidence, its refusal to collapse into what Dworkin called, quote, the quintessential feminine prose, end quote. Though she bragged she used, quote, language without its ever becoming decorative or pretty, end quote, there is elegance as well as aggression in Dworkin's sentences. She had a particular gift for conveying abstract concepts through acute, unusual metaphors. Quote, it's not as if there's an empty patch that you can see, and so one can say, there's my ignorance, it's about 10 by 10 and a dozen feet high, and someday someone will fill up that empty patch, end quote, she wrote in her memoir, Heartbreak. She was talking about male writers. She could be lyrical in her descriptions. Bessie Smith's voice, quote, tramped through your three-dimensional body, but gracefully, a Spartan, bear-like ballet, end quote. She could be very funny. Of a grade school teacher who gave her trouble, Dworkin says, quote, I knew I'd get her someday, and this is it. Eat shit, bitch. No one said that sisterhood was easy, end quote. But when most people think of Andrea Dworkin, they think of two things: overalls, her uniform, and the idea that all sex is rape. That was the notorious interpretation of Intercourse by many when it first came out in 1987, and, as Dworkin put in her preface 9 years later, the book is, quote, still being reviled in print by people who have never read it, reduced to slogans by journalists posing as critics or sages or deep thinkers, treated as if it were odious and hateful by every asshole who thinks that what will heal this violent world is more respect for dead white men. End quote. Intercourse is an inventive, combative, and wildly complicated piece of work, and to imagine that all there is between these covers is the assertion that all sex is rape is about as sophisticated as reducing Proust to a pile of Madeleine crumbs. But you don't have to be an asshole or even a journalist to take issue with some of what Dworkin said. Fury and drama characterize her rhetorical style, extremism her ideas, and Intercourse is perhaps her most radical work. Quote, am I saying I know more than men about fucking? Yes, I am, end quote, she tells us. And in a typical Dworkin flourish, she refuses to leave it at that. She gives her reader no room to soften her meaning through misinterpretation. Quote, not just different, more and better, end quote, she writes. Quote, deeper and wider, the way anyone used knows the user, end quote. There is not a doubt in her mind that she's right, and she concisely rejects a writing style. She consciously rejects a writing style that is placating or solicitous. She's not that kind of girl. She begins with an exploration of several, very different, male writers' depictions of female sexuality. We are shown, gently at first, forcefully as her text builds momentum, how much of literature positions women as not fully human or as filthy. With characteristic swagger, Dworkin compares Intercourse to Dante's Inferno, its spiraling structure descending into ever deeper circles of hell. If Dworkin's own vision of sex and society is extreme, we soon remember that so too is the context within which she writes. Quote, the normal fuck by the normal man is taken to be an act of invasion and ownership undertaken in a mode of predation, colonizing, forceful, manly, or nearly violent, the sexual act that by nature makes her his. End quote. There is the Bible to teach us this, of course, but there is also Tolstoy, Freud, Mailer, and so on. From these texts, Dworkin extracts the belief system we know, but sometimes like to forget. Her governed gendered relations in the West throughout the course of our history. Has governed gender relations in the West throughout the course of our history, that women are entities to be taken and possessed, walking, talking currency. Dworkin asseverates an alternative, a way of representing and having sex that dissolves boundaries and offers not only intimacy, but merged humanity, a kind of magic, fleeting selflessness. Quote, there is no physical distance, no self-consciousness, nothing withdrawn or private or alienated, no existence outside physical touch. The skin collapses as a boundary. It has no meaning. Time is gone. It, too, has no meaning. There is no outside. End quote. In these passages, Dworkin is a poet of erotic love, an incarnation that would shock those who have her figured as the embodiment of anti-sex. The profound passion she envisions does not even require an enduring emotional tie. Quote, in fucking, the deepest emotions one has about life as a whole are expressed, even with a stranger, however random or impersonal the encounter, end quote, she writes. There is room for escape, she suggests, even in the here and now, even in the country she refers to as America, more on this later, from the erotics of powerful differential. But if one finds this kind of sublime sexual release specifically in relinquishing control, what then? What does it mean to be aroused by dominance in the social context Dworkin describes? And if it turns us on, do we care? The way women have eroticized sexual possession is of great interest to Dworkin, of course. Quote, the experience of sexual possession for women is real and literal, end quote, she writes. Quote, without any magical or mystical dimension to it. Getting fucked and being owned are inseparably the same. Together, being one and the same, they are sex for women under male dominance as a social system, end quote. She may not have been saying all sex is rape, but clearly she was suggesting that most sex is something damn close when you live in a patriarchy. And where else do you live? In this world, which is the only world that exists. Quote, critiques of rape, pornography, and prostitution are sex negative, without qualification or examination, perhaps because so many men use these ignoble routes of access and domination to get laid, and without them, the number of fucks would so significantly decrease that men might nearly be chaste. End quote. Really? Do we believe that, quote, most women are not distinct private individuals to most men, end quote, still? Is voluntary intercourse instigated by female lust and desire something so uncommon? Are abuse and plunder the norm, mutual satisfaction the exception, so rare it proves the rule? Your answer to these questions, and to many others Dworkin poses in this book, will depend on the experience of sex you've been lucky or unlucky enough to have. But the value of questioning itself is substantial. Dworkin's profound and unique legacy was to examine the meaning of the act most of us take to be fundamental to sex, fundamental to human existence. As she puts it, quote, what intercourse is for women and what it does to women's identity, privacy, self respect, self determination, and integrity are forbidden questions. And yet, how can a radical or any woman who wants freedom not ask precisely these questions? End quote. You may find in reading Dworkin's work that many of her questions have never even crossed your mind. If you disagree with her answers, you may still find yourself indebted to her for helping you discover your own. Dworkin's description of her own sexual history is often grim, and given the title of the book you are about to read, and the premise that the personal is political, we are right to consider this. Though she stated, quote, I am not an exhibitionist, I don't show myself, end quote, in her book, Life and Death, she also wrote, quote, I have used everything I know, my life, to show what I believe must be shown so that it can be faced, end quote. Friends are murky, but something bad happened then. When Dworkin was 18 and a freshman at Bennington College, she was arrested after participating in a march against the Vietnam War and was taken to the Women's House of Detention in Greenwich Village, where she was subjected to a nightmarish internal exam by prison doctors. She bled for days afterward. Her family doctor looked at her injuries and cried. Dworkin's response to this incident was her first act of purposeful bravery. She wrote scores of letters to the newspapers detailing what had happened, and the story was reported in the New York Times, among other papers, which led to a government investigation of the prison. It was eventually torn down, and in its place today is the idyllic flower garden at the foot of the Jefferson Market Clock Tower on 6th Avenue in Manhattan. Like many members of the women's liberation movement, Dworkin started out as an anti-war activist and found her way to feminism when she became disillusioned with the men of the New Left. She wrote about the experience in Mercy, a book of quote-unquote fiction about a girl named Andrea who, like Dworkin, was from Camden, New Jersey, and was molested at around age 9, protested the war, and was jailed and sexually assaulted in a New York City prison. Quote, I went to the peace office, and instead of typing letters for the Peace Boys, I wrote to newspapers saying that I had been hurt, and it was bad, and not all right, and because I didn't know sophisticated words, I used the words I knew, and they were very shocked to death. And the Peace Boys were in the office, and I refused to type a letter for one of them, because I was doing this, and he read my letter out loud to everyone in the room over my shoulder, and they all laughed at me. and I had spelled America with a K because I knew I was in Kafka's world, not Jefferson's, and I knew America was the real country I lived in. End quote. In some of her books, Dworkin's writings echoes with the influence of the Beats. Allen Ginsberg was an early mentor who later became a nemesis of Dworkin's because she despised his sexual pursuit of underage boys. Because she wanted adventure and experience, and because she wanted to escape all of media attention following her battle against the prison, and because her family, her mother in particular, was deeply ashamed that she had been jailed, Dworkin decided to leave America for Europe when she was 19. She took the Orient Express from London to Athens, which she described as a quote unquote sordid trip, during which she gave all her money to a woman named Mildred, who promised to pay her back when they arrived, but didn't. Strangely, Dworkin quote unquote never held it against her, despite the fact that this Mildred induced pennilessness led Dworkin to start sleeping with men for money. She made it to Crete, where she created a temporary home for herself, perched above the quote unquote gem like surface of the Aegean. The dazzling beauty and utter foreignness of Dworkin's surroundings seemed to free her. In a place where one is literally a stranger, there can be an ecstatic sense of liberation from wondering why one has always felt so strange in what is supposed to be home. Dworkin wrote constantly, producing a book of poems called Child and a novel, Notes on Burning Boyfriend, named after the pacifist Norman Morrison, who had burned himself to death in protest of the Vietnam War, which she self published on the island. She had a passionate romance with a Greek man. Quote, "We're so much joined in the flesh that strangers feel the pain if we stop touching," end quote, Dworkin wrote. But ultimately, the allure and the money ran out, and Dworkin returned home to complete her studies. After graduating with a degree in literature, Dworkin returned to Europe, this time to Amsterdam, because she was interested in the Dutch countercultural Provo movement. But her life took an awful and unexpected turn when she met and married a Dutchman, an anarchist, who beat the living shit out of her. Years later, Dworkin's comrade, Susan Brownmiller, the author of the radical feminist classic Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, spoke out against Hedda Nussbaum's complicity in the murder of her daughter, Lisa Steinberg. Lisa was abused to death by her father, Nussbaum's husband, Joel Steinberg. In response, Dworkin published a piece in the Los Angeles Times called What Battery Really Is, in which she tried to explain her experience, Nussbaum's too, she asserted. Quote, "When I would come to after being beaten unconscious, the first feeling I would have was an overwhelming sorrow that I was alive. I would ask God, please, to let me die now. My breasts were burned with lit cigarettes. He beat my legs with a heavy wooden beam so that I couldn't walk. I was present when he did immoral things to other people. I didn't help them. Judge me, Susan." End quote. These experiences formed the basis of Dworkin's worldview. She wrote about them in her first published book, Woman Hating, which came out shortly after her return to the States in 1974. And in some way or other, these nightmarish pieces of her reality were picked over, deconstructed, and retold in everything she ever wrote. If you have never experienced such things, it can be difficult to relate to Dworkin. Sometimes, when you are reading her work, it can seem almost impossible to reconcile the world around you with the world on the page. Dworkin knew this. Quote, "Middle class women, including middle class feminists, cannot imagine such marginality. It's as if the story is too weird, too ugly, and too unsightly for an educated woman to believe." End quote. Much of society is set up specifically to assist people in their process of ignoring the horrors of the world. Dworkin's agenda was the opposite. Though she was herself middle class, educated, eligible for an easier life, there were other options open to her besides prostitution, for instance. When she was short of cash in Europe, Dworkin was drawn to the dark side in her writing and in her life. Quote, "The most immorality is in living a trivial life because one is afraid to face any other kind of life, a despairing life or an anguished life or a twisted and difficult life." End quote. Of course, for many people, there is little choice. For the women who had been battered or molested or raped, who read her books or came to her lectures, Dworkin was a savior goddess, a knight in shining armor. Dworkin often offered an unmitigated conception of the victim, a word, she said, that had a taint, but shouldn't. There was no such thing for Dworkin as a quote-unquote prostitute, for example. There were only quote-unquote prostituted women. She would stand before her followers on stage, huge and hollering, an evangelical, untouchable preacher for the oppressed. To borrow Gloria Steinem's language, Dworkin became the feminist movement's quote, Old Testament prophet, raging in the hills, telling the truth, end quote, as she understood it to be. Robin Morgan, the woman who edited the women's movement's Bible, Sisterhood is Powerful, and coined feminist slogans like, quote, porn is the theory, rape is the practice, end quote, has compared Dworkin to Malcolm X. Quote, people who, feminists even, raise their eyebrows at her supposed extremism or her intransigence or her fire took secret glee from that, end quote, Morgan told me in 2005, shortly after Dworkin's death. Quote, when Malcolm was killed, even some of the people in the black community who had said, well, he was always violent, they were devastated. Remember where Malcolm X came from? Malcolm X had been a pimp. Malcolm had been a hustler. Malcolm had been a drug addict. In the militant voice, it's the voice that would dare say what nobody else was saying, and it can't help but say it because it is speaking out of such incredible personal pain, end quote. There were other feminists who were as zealous in their convictions that pornography was, quote, the undiluted essence of anti-female propaganda, end quote, as Susan Brownmiller once put it. But nobody else could ever elicit the same disgust and fascination from the public as Andrea Dworkin. They didn't have her overalls or her anger. They weren't as big. People didn't just disagree with Dworkin, they hated her. To her detractors, she was the horror of women's lib personified, the angriest woman in America. With the possible exception of the Shakers, it is difficult to think of an American movement that has failed more spectacularly than anti-pornography feminism. In the late 1970s, when a prominent faction of the women's liberation movement, including Brownmiller, Dworkin, Steinem, Morgan, Audre Lorde, the writer Grace Paley, and the poet Adrienne Rich, turned their attention to fighting pornography, porn was still something marginalized, as opposed to what it is now, a source of inspiration for all of popular culture. Consider Jenna Jameson, Implants, almost any reality television show, Brazilian bikini waxes, thong underwear, and go from there. In her recent book, Women's Lives, Men's Laws, Dworkin's friend and colleague Catherine McKinnon put it like this, quote, the aggressors have won, end quote. If the anti-porn crusade was a losing battle, it was also a costly one. It divided. Some would say it destroyed the women's movement. The term quote-unquote pro-sex feminist was coined by women who wanted to distance themselves from the anti-porn faction. Of course, all feminists thought they were being pro-sex and fighting for freedom, but when it comes to sex, freedom means different things to different people. Screaming fights became a regular element of feminist conferences in the 1980s, and perhaps the single most divisive issue was an ordinance crafted by Dworkin and McKinnon. In 1983, when McKinnon was a professor of law at the University of Minnesota and Dworkin was teaching a course there on pornography at McKinnon's invitation. The two drafted a city ordinance positioning porn as a civil rights violation. Their legislation, which would allow people to sue pornographers for damages if they could show that they had suffered harm for pornography's making or use, was twice passed in Minneapolis, but vetoed by the mayor. Dworkin and McKinnon were subsequently summoned by the conservative mayor of Indianapolis, Indiana, and their legislation was signed into law in 1984 by a city council opposed to core feminist goals like legal abortion and the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. It was soon overturned by federal courts, but many feminists never forgave Dworkin and McKinnon and anti-porn feminists in general for getting in bed with the right wing. Dworkin was accused of being a man-hater, even by some members of her own movement, and she didn't write or make speeches with an eye toward mitigating this perception. In a speech she gave in Bryant Park at the Take Back the Night March in 1979, she called romance, quote, rape embellished with meaningful looks, end quote. In Heartbreak, she wrote, quote, men are shits and take pride in it, end quote. But in fact, the most significant person in Dworkin's life was a man, her husband. John Stoltenberg remembers feeling, quote, like we had walked off of a cliff, end quote, when he first met Dworkin. As if the force of their connection had rendered the world weightless beneath his feet. He was 29 and she was 27, and they started talking out on the street in the West Village after they'd both walked out of a benefit for the War Resistance League because they thought the protest songs were sexist. They started spending most of their time together. It was 1974. Quote, there was a party at the apartment where I was staying, end quote, Stoltenberg told me. Quote, she was there, and I think we were dancing, and then I think I passed out because I had had a lot to drink. And this could be little bit of revisionism, but I remember coming to consciousness with a clarity that I couldn't imagine life without her, end quote. 31 years later, almost to the day, he was forced to. Dworkin died of heart failure on April 9th, 2005, at the age of 58, in her bed in Washington, D.C., in an apartment they shared. At the time of her death, Dworkin felt clear-headed enough to write for only a few hours a day, the toll of a lifetime of insomnia and all of the pain medication she was taking for severe osteoarthritis. But she had just finished a proposal for a book of literary criticism. When I went to visit the apartment in early May, Stoltenberg had left untouched the yellow legal pad on which she'd been taking notes. Quote, use against Hemingway, Hitler, and Bush, end quote, it said in red pen. Above her desk was a poster that read, dead men don't rape. John Stoltenberg says Dworkin's first book, Woman Hating, quote unquote, saved my life. When he met Dworkin, Stoltenberg considered himself gay, and does to this day, although he preferred the word queer before it got trendy. Stoltenberg had sexual relationships with other men throughout the course of his life with Dworkin. Monogamy was not part of their deal. After Dworkin's death, Stoltenberg fell in love with a man who is now his domestic partner. Dworkin's dissection of gender in Woman Hating, her assertion that, quote, man and woman are fictions, caricatures, cultural constructs, reductive, totalitarian, inappropriate to human becoming, end quote, was to Stoltenberg a revelation, and he quoted that passage in a book he published in 1989 called Refusing to be a Man, which he dedicated to her. Stoltenberg did his own riff on her theme, writing about a version of Earth where the inhabitants, quote, find amazing and precious that because everyone's genitals stem from the same embryonic tissue, the nerves inside all of their genitals got wired very much alike. So these nerves of touch just go crazy upon contact in a way that resonates completely between them. My gosh, they think, you must feel something in your genital tubercle that intensely resembles what I'm feeling in my genital tubercle. End quote. His ideal world is a place where people, quote, have sex. They don't have asex, end quote. Whereas here on this planet, quote, we are sorted into one category or another at birth, based solely on a visual inspection of our groins. And the only question that's asked is whether there's enough elongated tissue around your urethra that you can pee standing up, end quote. In refusing to be a man, instead of saying quote unquote boy, Stoltenberg sometimes refers to little males as quote unquote child with a penis. Stoltenberg was himself an anti pornography activist for many years, and he used to facilitate quote unquote pose workshops at colleges in which male students were asked to assume the position in which women are photographed for pornography. Legs spread, pelvis raised, and so on. Quote, I will try to help people to understand what's wrong with the language of sexual orientation. Bisexual, homosexual, end quote, he told me. Quote, I said, think of yourself as being Jane sexual or Robbie sexual. It's not about gender, it's about a person, end quote. When he met Dworkin, it didn't matter to Stoltenberg that he was gay or that she didn't have enough elongated tissue around her urethra to pee standing up. Many of Dworkin's friends did not find out that she and Stoltenberg were legally married until they read her obituary in the newspapers. Quote, we hated being called husband and wife, end quote, Stoltenberg says. Quote, when pressed, we would just say spouse. Spouse or life partner are words that we used, end quote. Friends knew, of course, that the two had lived together for more than 30 years, but there are various reasons why Dworkin would not have wanted her marriage to a man to be public information. For one thing, there was the matter of her being a lesbian. Dworkin spoke about this many times. At a rally for Lesbian Pride Week in Central Park in 1975, when she was already living with Stoltenberg, Dworkin said, quote, this love of woman is the soil in which my life is rooted, end quote. She went on to talk about quote unquote erotic passion and intimacy among women and a quote wild, salty tenderness, end quote. But this is harder to get your head around if you are familiar with her oeuvre. In her writings, there are too many smoldering descriptions of heterosexual sex to count. But the mentions of lesbianism are either bloodless, quote, there is pride in the nurturant love, which is our common ground, end quote, or funny, quote, Q. There are a lot of rumors about your lesbianism. No one quite seems to know what you do with whom. A. Good, end quote, as she wrote in a satirical piece called Nervous Interview. Catherine McKinnon told me, quote, lesbian is one of the few words you've got to make a positive claim about identifying with women. To say I'm with women. It doesn't necessarily mean without men. Women are socially defined sexually as an inferior class. Lesbian is a sexual word. That's why it's stigmatized. In addition to her history and feelings, there's a lot that's a lot of why Andrea Dworkin identified it by it, I think. End quote. Another of Dworkin's closest friends had a different take on the matter of Dworkin's sexuality. In 30 plus years of knowing her, I've never heard of a single romance with a woman. Not one. End quote. Regardless of how and whether Dworkin practiced lesbianism, the fact remains that it was important to her to be identified as a lesbian. It's a label many people have difficulty claiming, yet to Dworkin it was a badge of rebellion against the patriarchy, a system she had warred against through her entire life. But has the institution of marriage not been a fundamental building block of that very system? Dworkin had questioned and probed and rejected every expression of male dominance she could think of, even intercourse, with remarkable creativity and devotion, and yet she married in secret. Why? At a memorial for Dworkin held at the National Arts Club in New York City about a month after her death, Stoltenberg suggested to the 100 or so assembled friends and fans that the reason he and Dworkin wed was partially practical. If Dworkin had not been his legal wife, she would not have been covered by his health insurance, and the bills for the frequent surgeries and hospital stays that punctuated the end of her life would have left the couple in financial ruins. So, Dworkin had real world reasons for playing within the rules of the system, even if it was a system she'd always abhorred. Ah, the real world. It'll get you every time. In the real world, many women would like to be regarded as sexually attractive, even if we don't like the reasons why, say, uncomfortable shoes and laborious, blow dried hair are considered desirable. We know it's a deranged system, and that our worth, including our self worth, ought to be measured by the same standards as men's. That our intellects and talents ought to be more important than our asses. But this is the system. This is the real world, and to act otherwise is to incur consequences. If you are overweight and you wear overalls, you will be mocked. If you don't, or can't, get legally married and a health crisis strikes, you will face additional pain. I like to think that getting married was as much a concession to romanticism as practicality for Dworkin. By all accounts, her partnership with Stoltenberg was as successful as it was non traditional. They were soulmates who stuck together for over 3 decades. But as a general rule, the certain and certainly on the page, Dworkin made very, very few concessions indeed. She didn't shy away from controversy or scorn or conflict. Quote, quote unquote, courted it, as Susan Brown Miller said to me. Quote, she would hang herself on her own cross, end quote. She was a difficult woman and a difficult writer, as she proudly acknowledged. Because if you accept what she was saying, suddenly you have to question everything: the way you dress, the way you write, your favorite movies, your sense of humor, and yes, the way you fuck. Good. If you want to feel better, watch a rerun of Will and Grace. Dworkin did. She was watching it the night she died. If you want to revel in the exquisite, problematic rituals of femininity, go to a museum or a mall. But if you want to be morally and intellectually challenged, to be asked impossible questions, to see the mind of a revolutionary in action, read Dworkin. There is very little I would presume to say on Andrea Dworkin's behalf, but I will posit the following. She wanted a new and different world, a world that would be unrecognizable in many ways. She wanted to end violence against women and sexual violence in general. But there was one thing she badly wanted. That was, and is, entirely possible. She wanted what all writers want, and what she actually deserves to be read. Ariel Levi. Preface. Preface. When I finished writing Intercourse, one colleague advised me to add an introduction to explain what the book said. That was, reader that way, readers would not be shocked, afraid, and angry, because the ideas would be familiar, pre-chewed, easier to digest. I would be protected from bad or malicious readings and purposeful distortions, and my eagerness to explain myself would show what I wanted people like me and my sorry, show that I wanted people to like me and my book, the quintessential feminine pose. At least one knee would be visibly bent. Other colleagues, probably more to the point, told me straight out to publish it under a pseudonym. I would not, and Intercourse became, socially speaking, a Rorschach ink blot in which people saw their fantasy caricatures of me and what they presumed to know about me. First published in the United States in 1987, simultaneously with my novel Ice and Fire, Intercourse is still being reviled in print by people who have not read it, reduced to slogans by journalists posing as critics or sages or deep thinkers, treated as if it were odious and hateful by every asshole who thinks that what will heal this violent world is more respect for dead white men. My colleagues, of course, had been right, but their advice offended me. I have never written for a cowardly or passive or stupid reader, the precise characteristics of most reviewers. Overeducated but functionally illiterate members of a gang, a pack, who do their drive-by shootings in print and experience what they call, quote unquote, the street at cocktail parties. Quote unquote, I heard it on the street, they say, meaning a penthouse closer to heaven. It is no accident that most of the books published in the last few years about the decline and fall of Anglo European culture because of the polluting effect of women of all races and some men of color, and there are a slew of such books, have been written by white boy journalists. Abandoning the J school ethic of who, what, where, when, how, and the discipline of Hemingway's lean, masculine prose, they now try to answer why. That decline and fall, they say, is because talentless, uppity women infest literature, or because militant feminists are an obstacle to the pro rape, pro dominance art of talent, of talented living or dead men, or because the multicultural reader, like to be female and or not white, values Alice Walker and Toni Morrison above Aristotle and the Marquis de Sade. Hallelujah, I say. Intercourse is a book that moves through the sexed world of dominance and submission. It moves in descending circles, not in a straight line, and, as in a vortex, each spiral goes down deeper. Its formal model is Dante's Inferno. Its lyrical debt is to Rimbaud. And equally, it envisions sorry, the equality it envisions is rooted in the dreams of women, silent generations, pioneer voices, lone rebels, and masses who agitated, demanded, cried out, broke laws, and even begged. The beginning was a substitute for retaliatory violence, doing bodily harm back to those who use or injure you. I want women to be done with begging. Intercourse is a book that moves through the public censure of women as if it were rabid because we speak without apology about the world in which we live is a strategy of threat that usually works. Men often react to women's words, speaking and writing, as if they were acts of violence. Sometimes men react to women's words with violence. So we lower our voices. Women whisper, women apologize, women shut up. Women trivialize what we know, women shrink, women pull back. Most women have experienced enough dominance from men, control, violence, insult, contempt, that no threat seems empty. Intercourse does not say, forgive me and love me. It does not say, I forgive you, I love you. For a woman writer to thrive, or arguably to survive, in these current hard times, forgiveness and love must be subtext. No. I say no. Can a man read Intercourse? Can a man read a book written by a woman in which she uses language without its ever becoming decorative or pretty? Can a man read a book written by a woman in which she, the author, has a direct relationship to experience, ideas, literature, life, including fucking, without mediation, such that what she says and how she says it are not determined by boundaries men have set for her? Can a man read a book? Can a man read a woman's work if it does not say what he already knows? Can a man let in a challenge not just to his dominance, but to his cognition? And, specifically, am I saying that I know more than men about fucking? Yes, I am. Not just different, more and better, deeper and wider. The way anyone used knows the user. Intercourse does not narrate my experience to measure it against Norman Mailer's or D.H. Lawrence's. The first person is embedded in the way the book is built. I use Tolstoy, Kobo Abe, James Baldwin, Tennessee Williams, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Flaubert, not as authorities, but as examples. I use them. I cut and slice into them in order to exhibit them. But the authority behind the book, behind each and every choice, is mine. In formal terms, then, intercourse is arrogant, cold, and remorseless. You, the reader, will not be looking at me, the girl. You will be looking at them. In intercourse, I created an intellectual and imaginative environment in which you can see them. The very fact that I usurp their place, make them my characters, lessens the unexamined authority that goes not with their art, but with their gender. I love the literature these men created, but I will not live my life as if they are real and I am not. Nor will I tolerate the continuing assumption that they know more about women than we know about ourselves. And I do not believe that they know more about intercourse. Habits of defense can be broken, and it is up to the writers to break them. Submission can be refused, and I refuse it. Of course, men have read and do read Intercourse. Many like it and understand it. Some few have been thrilled by it. It suggests to them a new possibility of freedom, a new sexual ethic, and they do not want to be users. Some men respond to the radicalism of intercourse, the ideas, the prose, the structure, the questions that both underlie and intentionally subvert meaning. But if one's sexual experience has always, and without exception, been based on dominance, not only overt acts, but also metaphysical and ontological assumptions, how can one read this book? The end of male dominance would mean, in the understanding of such a man, the end of sex. If one has eroticized a differential in power that allows for force as a natural and inevitable part of intercourse, how could one understand that this book does not say that all men are rapists or that all intercourse is rape? Equality is the realm of sex in an anti-sexual idea if sex requires dominance in order to register as sensation. As sad as I am to say it, the limits of old Adam, the dimaterial power he still has, especially in publishing and media, have set limits on public discourse, by both men and women, about this book. In general, women get to say yea or nay to intercourse, which is taken to be a synonym for sex. In this reductive, brave new world, women like sex or we do not. We are loyal to sex or we are not. The range of emotions and ideas expressed by Tolstoy et al. Is literally forbidden to contemporary women. Remorse, sadness, despair, alienation, obsession, fear, greed, hate, all of which men, especially male artists, express, are simply no votes, are simple no votes for women. Compliance means yes. A simplistic rah-rah means yes. Affirming the implicit right of men to get laid regardless of the consequences to women is a yes. Reacting against force or exploitation means no. Affirming pornography and prostitution means yes. Quote unquote, I like it is the standard for citizenship, and quote unquote, I want it pretty much exhausts the Fifth Amendment's meaning for women. Critical thought or deep feelings, critical thought or deep feeling puts one into the Puritan camp, that hallucinated place of exile where women with complaints are dumped, after which we can be abandoned. Why, socially speaking, feed a woman you can't fuck? Why fuck a woman who might ask a question, let alone have a complex emotional life or a political idea? I refuse to tolerate this loyalty oath approach to women and intercourse, or women and sexuality, or, more to the point, women and men. The pressure on women to say yes now extends to 13-year-old girls who face a social gulag if they are not hot, accommodating, and loyal. Increasingly, they face violence from teenage boys who think that intercourse is ownership. The refusal to let women feel a whole range of feelings, express a whole range of ideas, address our own experience with an honesty that is not pleasing to men, ask questions that discomfit and antagonize men in their dominance, has simply created a new generation of users and victims. Children, boys and girls respectively. The girls are getting fucked, but they are not getting free or equal. It is time to notice. They get fucked, they get hit, they get raped by boyfriends in high school. Intercourse wants to change what is happening to those girls. Intercourse asks at least some of the right questions. Intercourse conveys the density, complexity, and political significance of the act of intercourse. What it means that men, and now boys, feel entitled to come into the privacy of a woman's body in a context of inequality. Intercourse does this outside the boundaries set by men for women. It crosses both substantive and formal boundaries in what it says and how it says it. For me, the search for truth and change using words is the meaning of writing. The prose, the thinking, the journey is sensuous and demanding. I have always loved the writing that takes one down deep, no matter how strange or bitter or dirty the descent. As a writer, I love the experience of caring, of remembering, of learning more, of asking, of wanting to know, and to see and to say. Intercourse is a search and assertion, passion and fury, and its form, no less than its content, deserves critical scrutiny and respect. Andrea Dworkin, August 1995. Brooklyn, New York.